So welcome to today's webinar entitled IBM Cloud Migration Considerations. Today's going to be 40 to 45 minute webinar, and we're going to look at IBM I and the cloud. And we're going to explore how best to both initiate that migration and some of the steps that are needed to get you there. And I'm not on my own today. Tom, do you want to give us a little bit about your bio, what you do for Help Systems?
Yes, great. Absolutely, Ash. Great to be here with you today on, a very exciting topic, as I'm sure many of us are working from home these days. We're thinking about remote access, and, this is just going to bleed more into that. I'm Tom Huntington, our Executive Vice President of Technical Solutions at Help Systems, long Help Systems employee, and I'm also an IBM Power champion, and I've been working with many of the different cloud providers and private cloud providers, if you want to get into the MSP space, for many years. So very excited to be here, Ash.
Thank you, Tom. Randy, what do you do for Help Systems?
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, I'm been working with Help Systems since they acquired us. It's almost 2 years ago. With Mid-Range Performance Group. And I've been working with, as Tom says, many of you probably on the phone, not only customers, but MSPs and business partners, and have been doing capacity planning and performance basically most of my career. So looking forward to discuss some of the things that I see as, some of the challenges and some of the things to look forward to as you think about moving to the cloud.
Fantastic. And Randy, we've been colleagues for 30 years, right?
Plus. About the same amount of time, yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That was about the time I started getting involved in mid-range machines, really. So I'm based out of the UK, and I'm a pre-sales engineer, and I sit on the Common Europe Advisory Council, where we get to help review RFEs, decide their impact in the community, and have IBM's ear, so we get to collaborate on a regular basis. So the agenda today, we're going to start off by talking about why move applications to the cloud to begin with. What are the advantages? We're then going to look at how to identify workloads that are best suited for cloud. Can everything run in the cloud? We're going to do a little bit of digging there. We're then going to wheel Randy in, and we're going to talk about sizing techniques designed to avoid excessive charges. And in this section, we're going to delve into the aspects of capturing workload so that you don't pay too much or budget for too little in terms of cloud resources. Obviously, some think that cloud is cheap, and yep, it can be, in the same way that hiring a car can be considered cheap, but it's not so cheap if it's sitting on your drive most of the week. So we're going to delve a bit deeper into that. Next, we'll look at how best to get that IBM I data into the cloud, both as a one-off to get it there to begin with, and then to keep it in sync with your on-prem environment until the point in time where you've migrated to cloud and you're ready to power your old box off. We'll then highlight some of the pitfalls with regards to your data and how to avoid them, before finally we'll make you aware of some of the licensing considerations. Okay, so cloud adoption. This is an interesting one. So this is one of the questions that Help Systems ask as part of their annual marketplace survey. In fact, we only started asking this particular question in 2019. So this is from the 2020. So in 2019, those IBM I shops that were solely on-prem stood at around 83%. In the latest survey that we published in January this year, this percentage dropped to 77%, so a 6% shift. So there's 23% of IBM I environments that have their IBM I in the cloud, or maybe have some kind of hybrid mix. And I fully expect to see more workload going to the cloud in the coming year, especially with IBM, Microsoft Azure, SkyTap. I think Google have plans too for public cloud for I. Plus there's I in the cloud and many others. So before we get started today, let me hand over to Tom. Tom's going to run the first of 2 polling questions.
Excellent, thank you, Ash. During this unprecedented times, where are you struggling most? And this is a select all that apply, and you can't make a mistake on this. So are you having problems with remote access to IT functions like managing backups, getting end user report distribution out, coordinating batch activity across all your servers, security concerns with remote access, and monitoring our servers remotely? These are some of the things that have come up in the last few weeks with our team as we've been going through the COVID-19 epidemic, and we thought it would be interesting to see with today's webinar what are you most faced with. And we have a variety of customers, business partners, and MSPs themselves with us today. So recognize a lot of familiar faces out there, Ash and Randy. I apologize, but we could only have 5 options here. We probably should have been adding in performance, considering we're going to talk a lot about capacity today.
That's okay.
Yes,
We'll get to that later on.
We'll talk later, right? Okay.
That's right.
Okay, good. Hey, also while this is going on, if you are looking for additional education on IBMI, you should look towards IBM's Common, or not IBM, but Commons organization. They're bringing in a virtual Common education session starting next week. I think it's May 5th through 7th. I could be wrong, but just go out to common.org and sign up for that. There's a lot of great education out there on this platform during that event. Ash, how we doing? Let's see on our results. Let me close the poll. I think that's long enough. Not everybody voted, so I just, I don't know what to do about that. We would love to get more of you to vote and participate. It helps out with the webinar, makes the content a little better, but let's see, security concerns, certainly 59%, and gosh, that's a concern for everybody there, and remote access to the systems is certainly. And then next we get back to backups. I've had a few customers say, I don't know what to do now. We manually log our backups and somebody's not in the data center to change dates, right? That's the issue there. Monitoring our servers remotely and having that being done unattended. Coordinating batch activity seems to be pretty well handled. And another one that was interesting was just, end users who have been dependent on reports that print out in the office. What are you doing about that? So, all right, thank you for answering that. Very good set of responses.
Wonderful, thank you, Tom. So why move applications to cloud? Well, with IBMI home to some critical applications for those in finance, manufacturing, healthcare, distribution, logistics, gaming, I'm sure I've missed some out to name but a few, moving these critical, highly transactional workloads to anywhere was, I guess, unthinkable a few years ago. Now, like many, I'm a huge fan of cloud, but for these workloads, it would be a mistake to think that cloud is just another data center and that traditional ways of working and thinking are completely transferable to the cloud. Some are, but some not so. Moving applications to cloud, particularly if we're talking IBMI, requires planning, and if done right, enables you to offer a better user experience, enables you to scale with flexibility. You don't have that with on-prem. You can manage costs. You've got ultimate visibility there as to how much you're consuming and how much you're going to consume. And it provides you with the opportunity to innovate and modernize faster than ever before. If you're thinking about moving workloads to cloud, if you're thinking that it's just someone else's data center, I think you're missing the opportunities that really cloud provides. So let's take a little look about some of the reasons why you might want to move applications to the cloud. HADR, probably the most popular reason right now to use cloud for IBMI is for HA and DR. We work with many customers that maybe haven't previously considered a HA solution, maybe because they don't have a second data center, or maybe their pockets aren't deep enough to invest in software and hardware for that just in case scenario. DevOps, this has gained in popularity over the last 5 years, and having the ability to quickly spin up a cloud-based LPAR, snapshot it, conduct tests, revert that snapshot again and again, are really worth their weight in gold. Just a simple example in there. Dwindling expertise, another help system survey question, concerns IBM expertise, and consistently around half the respondents each year are flagging this as a worry or a concern. So moving workloads where you have few in-house skills to somewhere else might help mitigate some of that risk. Especially in the current climate with many businesses struggling, we've seen evidence that evidence of clients struggling to fund a large outlay for new hardware. Moving it to the cloud could maybe help this cause. Unless you're a managed service provider, providing IT isn't really your core business. So moving some applications to cloud could simplify your environment. We're not necessarily talking IBM I here. I'm thinking vanilla applications, maybe like email, where it doesn't really matter who runs it or where. Anyway, more on that later, just food for thought really. I talked about costs a little bit earlier, but there could well be some savings in both hardware and software maintenance. And some of these can be quite hefty. And I know Tom's going to talk briefly about licensing and licensing considerations a little bit later on. As we move through this slide, the advent of the public cloud is the next point. And this is where it really came about, the flexibility for various workload swings. The provision of additional processing power to cater for maybe seasonal swings or spikes in business. Nice for the business to be able to get these upturns, but for those of us sitting at the coalface in IT, it can be tough. And just a small anecdote here, I joined a travel company some time back, well before my time at Help Systems. I joined them in December. My first job was to conduct a capacity plan. And immediately it became clear that the current box just couldn't cope with the January and February peak workloads in bookings. I had to write a justification paper on day 3 for almost $90,000, and that was for an interim processor upgrade. And that was just to buy some time so we could plan a proper hardware refresh. They were scary times. We spent an awful lot of money very quickly. Board directive. Not so common these days. I think knowledge is a lot more prevalent. But when cloud was shiny and new, you'd hear of CEOs getting excited about it and issue instructions that everything had to move to cloud. If only life was as easy as that. Nothing wrong with a cloud-first approach, but thankfully many people now are more educated in that particular area. And finally, modelization. This allows you to move to new hardware, to a newer version of the operating system quickly, and without the need necessarily to go cap in hand to the business for capex authorization, which we talked about a little earlier. So, how do we identify workloads best suited for cloud? Well, I mentioned that public service or public cloud services were really born as a result of retail sector having peaks in business. I mentioned January and February for holiday and travel companies. Other peaks have other businesses have peaks in the build up to Christmas, Black Friday, seasonal sales. Without cloud, you have no choice but to ensure that sufficient capacity is available within your enterprise, despite the fact that for the majority of the year, you're not going to need that additional headroom. So for production environments, variable workloads is still probably the most common reason for cloud adoption. Here we go. Number 2 here, why not take a step back? This is something I really advocate. Take a step back and understand what your core business is and what it isn't. Applications like payroll and email, they're critical to companies, but unless you provide email or payroll services, these applications they're much of a muchness, and there's no real value by running them on-prem. Even if you were to run these super efficiently, they'll have close to zero impact on your bottom line. So for these applications, it makes total sense to migrate these to the cloud. At 3 here, unknown or new no workloads. What better way for a new application or workload that you're not 100% sure about the amount of infrastructure or resources? Why not deploy that to cloud? You've got the flexibility to flex up or down at the drop of a hat. And remember, it doesn't need to live on cloud forever. Think of this as a try before you buy. Applications that are used globally. Now, many cloud providers allow you to deploy to one or to multiple regions, but it goes without saying that different services are available in different regions. And in some cases, the price of these services can differ depending on which region you choose. If an application you intend to move to cloud isn't used all over the globe, but maybe is used in maybe a specific region, maybe deploy it in closest proximity to where its users are to help minimize any potential latency concerns. And then finally on this slide, number 5, those applications with the fewest regulatory restrictions. I'm going to cover this in some detail later on, but there's things like data sovereignty, there's data localization, there's data residency to consider here. So data residency, this relates to where a business specifies that their data is stored. Data sovereignty is the idea that data is subject to the laws and governance structures within the nation it's collected. Quite a difference there. And data localization, these are regulations enforcing you on how the data can be processed in a certain territory. These are often used interchangeably, but there are some subtle differences. So I'll cover these with some examples in a short while. Now, cloud providers charge by the resources and services used, multiplied obviously by the time you use them for, with some charging by the hour, others by the minute, and I understand that some actually charge by the second. Randy, can you talk to us about how clients can size their workloads and also how cloud providers can help clients to measure the resources required so they're not selling them too much and too little?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for that good overview, Ash, there. So as Ash mentioned, there is a lot of things to think about when you're going to move any workload, whether it's like an application, like he's mentioned, your HA or DR, or backups or whatever to the cloud. There's a lot of things that you need to think about that you might not have thought were important. But I think Ash did a good job of kind of going through some of the highlights. But one of the things now, you ultimately, whenever you decide what you're going to move to the cloud, obviously the question is, well, how do I now, okay, this is what I want to do, then how do I plan for that? And certainly one of the questions is, do I need to plan differently? And the answer is absolutely, it's different. In other words, it's different than on-prem because the dynamics of what's going on in the cloud versus an on-prem solution they are different, right? So you certainly do have to think about how to size this opportunity. And as we talked about earlier, what we're really trying to do is try to take advantage of what one of the big key benefits of the cloud is to minimize the cost, right? In other words, be able to dynamically increase or decrease resources as you need them, right? Only pay for what you use, as the term is often used. So you do have to plan differently. And of course, that all starts with do I need performance data? Can I run performance data in the cloud? Well, you certainly can and absolutely should, because even before you move it, you need data, because unless you have performance data, you really can't answer some of those questions that Ash was talking about. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next couple of slides here. But, what is my workload? And is it just this workload? Is it DevOps? Is it HA? And so, for example, let's talk about HA. Let's say, HA, I'm going to use some very general terms here. Let's say needs 1/4 or 1/3 the resources from a CPU standpoint than you might need in productive. However, if you have a role swap, obviously you need to be able to spin up that cloud to support the full resources that you had on your production side, right? So, but while you're just running HA and DR, you certainly don't want to be paying for a twin, as I would call it, or the full, because you're not going to ever use it, right? You're only going to use it whenever you do a role swap. So, but you certainly need to collect data. Now, question often that comes in is who's going to collect that data? In other words, is it the customer's responsibility to collect and look at that data, or is it the cloud vendor's responsibility? So those are questions that probably need to be discussed. And of course, what happens if we start to use more resources than we expected? As one of the things Ash mentioned, so what happens if you had added a new application, or you upgraded to a different version of the software, and all of a sudden you started using more resources? Well, what happens? Well, there's two questions to that. What happens performance-wise, right? And from a CPU, disk, and memory point of view, right? And obviously the cost side of that equation, right? What happens to the cost effectiveness? And without monitoring this, obviously no one's going to have an educated guess at it. You're just going to be like throwing a dart as to possibly what needs to happen, right? So it's really, you need to understand how flexible your particular cloud vendor is in dynamically increasing or decreasing, those resources, right? And of course, what happens if you do have a performance issue? And of course, when you're talking about performance issues, in general, we're talking about three things at a very high level. We're talking about response time, whether it's cloud or interactive. You're talking about throughput. In other words, how many jobs can I get through in a given hour or 2 hours or overnight? And you're talking about turnaround time. How fast does a batch job run, right? And there's many factors that are going to impact those. So when you're thinking about performance issues, you need to think about what's important to you. As Ash was saying, to your business, what's important? I mean, it could be one of those, like response time, or it could be throughput. It could be all three of them. You have jobs that need to run in a particular hour or two. You might you need 1,000 jobs to go through overnight, and response time. So, identify really what's important to you, because when you go to the cloud, depending on the vendor and the hardware, you may or may not get what you think you're going to get. And the only way to do that is obviously look at performance data. And of course, what controls a lot of this is the contract. Look at the detail. When I'm talking to a lot of customers who move to the cloud, and I'm talking to the technical or the admin side of the house, unfortunately, they often don't get to look at the contract. And I think they should, because this is usually a legal issue or an executive issue that they're looking at the contract. But the contract really spells out how flexible, A, the cloud is, and B, how much it's going to cost if you go up or down, right? And I think the technical or the administration people can add some value in understanding, is there going to be any potential issues to avoid, any excessive charges or whatever. So having the administration people, the technical people understand what the contract says, I think is very important, because they can add some value as to what's going to happen. And a lot of questions, people say, do I lose control? Well, the answer is yes and no. Yes, you are.
Ash, I think we lost Randy's audio for just a bit.
I think we have, haven't we? Let's just, let me just take a look.
So I think his topic he was on was losing control, right? And that is something too that as administrators and managers are quite concerned with, and we need to consider that, and as part of our discussion with your management team and of course the cloud provider too. At the end of the day, I think really the important thing to think about is, just because you're going to the cloud, a lot of the things you've been doing on premise don't go away unless they're part of the contract specifically. And as administrators and IT directors, you need to be aware of that. Well, should we get him back?
He's offline at the moment. He's dropped offline.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we caught him in the middle of climbing one of those peaks in Colorado, and he's out of cell phone coverage. I'm not sure.
But this is one of the perils where we're working from home and not working in offices. But I guess I can cover that. I can cover this slide for him.
Yeah, please.
It's kind of understanding really where your peak workload is, and unless we're measuring workloads, we don't know that. Randy talked earlier about performance data. What he's really talking there about is collection services data. So collection services data on I is, I think it's turned on by default. So the tool that Randy looks after, Performance Navigator, uses that collection services data. It shrinks that data, because that can be quite hefty. It shrinks that data and presents it in a usable graphical tool alongside AX and Linux. So you can manage your workloads that way. And once you have that in the tool, you can build up months, if not years, of historical data. But once you can see that data, you can work out when your peak is. Oh, I think Randy is he's appearing back in now. Bear with me one moment.
Yeah, I think that, and one of the things that Randy always talks about is the nice thing about the Power technology. If you're on IBM I, you have the collection services, and you can take your real workload and use that for consideration as you move into the cloud, because otherwise often when you go to the cloud, you're sizing, or you're not sizing, you're using a partial system. You're using a partition, and it may not have the same characteristics as what you had on premise. We've seen some horror stories where people have not considered things like, we were internal disk when we were on-prem, and now we're external disk when we go into the cloud, and they had a very IO intensive application, and the next thing you know, they're not happy with the cloud provider, and they didn't realize that really it was just a sizing activity, as Randy would say, that would have prevented a major surprise for that type of customer. So
that's right, Tom. And I think we can have Randy back now. We've managed to fill Randy for you on this particular slide.
Andy, I don't want to say who needs you, but come on now.
No. You were right on track there, Tom, and thanks for jumping in. This is one of the downsides of obviously working remotely. Sometimes this is what happens, right? So, sure. But as Tom was just mentioning, again, you just basically need to understand your workloads, right? Whether it's low, peak, average, and so forth. And again, unless you're collecting data and looking at that, you're not going to have an idea. This is how you're going to control costs. As mentioned, a lot of vendors are charging many different ways, right? Seconds, hours, CPW, core. There's a lot of ways to charge for this resource in the cloud, and you need to understand how your particular profile of your particular workload is using those resources so that you can best control them.
Mm-hmm.
If we go to the next slide, we'll talk about, give you some examples of how that would work. So a couple of things that we've noticed. So the picture, of course, we're using Performance Navigator to look at this data. And as you can see in the graph there, you can see that there's one little spike. Now, the question might be, if you're looking at the cloud, and I'm going to move this workload to the cloud, well, is that an anomaly, right? Is this a one-time event? Did it happen once a week? Other thing is important, right? It may not be important, right? In other words, what if this job ran for 2 hours instead of 1 hour? Is it really important, right? So again, these are some of the questions you need to ask, because that could affect the cost that you're going to consume when you go to the cloud, right? And again, understanding what caused that spike could help identify whether that's important or not. And of course, looking at the job detail and understanding which jobs are causing the CPU to spike could certainly help answer some of those questions. So again, understanding the workloads in, as we mentioned, low, averages, and peaks, and not only what your peaks are, but are those peaks important? As we mentioned before, hopefully before I got cut off, is it important for response time, throughput, and so forth. So going to the next slide, we can actually give you a couple of examples here. So if you look at this case, we're looking at an 870. It happens to be a 64 core machine. And as you can see in the third line of the title, this happens to be a 16 core machine that is in the shared pool, but it's actually capped because the 16 and 16 says the desired and the virtuals are the same. So in this case, if this were in the cloud, this is probably an on-prem machine, but if you were in the cloud, you technically cannot dynamically go anywhere. In other words, you're stuck at 16. So if you're close at 95% busy for many hours during the peak part of the day, if you needed more than 16, you're sort of out of luck. And depending on how the machine is configured, and I'm talking about Power VM here, and how it's configured as far as minimums and maximums, it may not be that straightforward as to how fast you can increase this to 16 or 17 or 18. But if you'll notice down at the bottom, we actually give you some information that management likes to see is, how much room do I have to grow? It's only 5%. And of course, we do some math for you to say that's about 2% growth per year for 3 years. So it's not a lot of room. Now, if you never grow anywhere, the phone's not ringing, in other words, throughput and turnaround time and response time is okay, then this is fine. I mean, these machines are designed to run at 80+% busy, as long as the phone doesn't ring. But even at that point, sometimes the phone can ring. So in this case, let's say, well, what if we need more room to grow, right? And so what we can certainly do in model this stuff, right? So we can say, well, what if we increase the number of cores? So if you go to the next slide there, Ash, you can see that here we said, let's go to 23 instead of 16. And at the bottom here, you'll notice now the room for growth is 51%, which equals to 15% a year for 3 years. Now, if you're doing an on-prem solution, this probably makes sense because you buy it and you want to have some room to grow in the future, right? When you're in the cloud, obviously, you may want to run this, I want to call it at a lower room for growth, and use the expandability of the cloud vendors to respond to any workload growth, right? But again, it's just important about understanding this workload and how important it is to you. But regardless, when we use this product, we need to understand not only the workload, but you need to understand the machine, right? So I'll give you a great example. You'll notice this is an 870, and you see the megahertz is 20 megahertz. So I'll tell you why that's important, right? So if you go to a cloud vendor, and let's say you move this to a machine that's 3,800 megahertz instead of 4,000 megahertz. What does that mean? Well, that technically means that a single threaded job is going to run slower. So if turnaround time is important, then you may have to think about that, right? So again, there's not only desired and virtuals and megahertz and so forth that's important when you're designing these systems. And again, disk, I think Tom was mentioning, when you go to the cloud, 99.9% of the time, you are going to external disk. So if you're going from an internal disk situation today to an external disk, it would be really nice to understand the implications from a performance standpoint, if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And by the way, I've seen probably more than a half a dozen people who went to the cloud and had to go back on-prem, and the reason was disk. Because you really had to understand there's so many options with external disk that you really have to understand the configuration from the hardware standpoint. So those are also good questions to ask. And of course, memory also is important to understand. Do you need all the memory you currently have, or can you get by with less memory and so forth? So Again, there's a lot of questions that from a hardware configuration standpoint that can affect the cost. But without looking at the data, it's sort of difficult to take a real good guess at that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Randy.
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. I guess we're on to the polling question next, and just some, we'll launch the question and then do our best to kind of recap it here. How do you currently size your workloads and performance capacity plans? Again, select all that apply. I apologize, there are none, but we can only ask 5 questions, or I guess we can have 5 answers on any question. So our business partner does this for us. We use Performance Navigator. We use another tool. If you do use something else, if you could use the chat or the question toolbar and let us know what that is, that would be wonderful. Appreciate that. We perform these activities manually. People do use Excel, and I run into that a ton, especially in the AIX space where people are doing things based by the school of hard knocks, as Randy would call it, and on-the-job training kind of stuff, whereas instead of just using Nmon and a tool like Performance Navigator that can do it for you automatically. Or we don't currently do anything. We don't worry about it. Somebody else is going to take care of the problem for us. So if you could answer that polling question, that's great. One of the things I was thinking about as Randy was going through his charts, as people are in the cloud, if we think about today's epidemic that's gone on way too long already around the world, there are some businesses that have definitely excelled or needed to excel in this time. And if you're in the cloud, one of the benefits there is that I'm assuming the cloud provider can provide you more resources if you need it. Whereas if you're on premise, are you going to be able to get your business partner out there, IBM, whoever, to upgrade your system to add more technology to it to handle your growth? All right, well, enough of that. Let's see if we can close this polling question and share the results. And there we go. Looks like 49% of you are already using Performance Navigator. Well, Randy, I think you have a lot of fans with you today. 25% not doing anything. I'm sorry, 30% the business partner does it. 15% are using something else, and 15% are using Excel spreadsheets. Awesome. All right, thank you. And let me close this polling question. Ash, back over to you to move it ahead, and let's talk about, one of the biggest questions that we hear from customers is, how do I get my data into the cloud, right? And I think some of the cloud providers are asking the same question, right? We've had a lot of discussions with that, Ash, and there's a lot of different ways available to you, but reality is, what's the best way and what is the least impactful on your business is really the ultimate answer here. So certainly you can save your on-premise data and then restore it in the cloud. But one of the things you have to think about is a lot of the cloud providers don't really have standard tape technology anymore. They might have a virtual tape library, but do they have one you have? So that's a trying situation if you're going to think about moving to the cloud via tape. Partial restore, maybe you just worry about your data, which ultimately what does matter, it is your data. That's I've always said that for years when it comes to backup and recovery, is you can always go out and get another version of QRPG or even QGPL and modify the things you modified, but you can't go get your business data. SAN, certainly people are doing storage-based replication into the cloud, and using that as technology. And of course, we talked about traditional backups, but reality is, a tool that uses local and remote journaling is probably the cleanest way and best way to move your data to the cloud, because what you can do is do this over time. And this can be a transition process versus a conversion, where we set up the technology like the Robot HA product to help you migrate your data to the cloud. So we can define the rules on your production system, connect it up to the, technically it's another partition, it's in the cloud, we don't care where it's at in the world. Use the communication connections to send your data over. Obviously, if you're sending terabytes and terabytes of data, this is going to take some time if you're going to do it all via the wire via the internet. But you can do it, and customers do it. Or you can get that virtual tape copy over there, restore it in the cloud, and then start your replication from there. And this allows you to transition, keep both versions in sync until you're actually ready to basically do a role swap to the cloud and run your business from there. So that's what it is. It's a period of time that you're going to run. It might only be a week, it might be a month for some of you, and for some of you it might be 3 months that we want to be able to run this way until we actually role swap and actually take our on-premise IBM business into the cloud. And then it all comes down to, now what's your responsibility? We've been talking about that, and what you have to do to make sure that this can coexist and you can continue your business that way. Now, the other thing to think about here too is you can do what we call DR as a service or HA as a service, and many we have several MSPs that are with us today. This is nothing new to them. They've been running high availability for customers and being able to help them out for years now. Ash, back over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Data security risks and how to avoid them. So let's have a little look here. Firstly, let's talk about regulatory restrictions. Now, each of you, I'm sure, has a different set of regulations that you have to adhere to. So to start here, the best course of action is to find out whether any of these restrictions actually state or recommend, there's a subtle difference there, that certain data can't be stored in the cloud. Now let's delve a little deeper. Data residency. This relates to where a business specifies that their data is stored. This is in a geographical location of their choice, usually for regulatory or policy reasons. An example of data residency requirement could be where a company wishes to maybe take advantage of a more advantageous approach to tax. So doing so will usually require the business to prove they are not conducting too great a proportion of core business activities outside that country's borders, including the processing of data. They'll therefore impose a data residency that requires them to use certain infrastructures, and then impose strict data management workflows on themselves and any cloud providers in order to protect their taxation rights. So that's data residency. Data sovereignty, it differs in that not only is the data stored in a designated location, but the data is also subject to the laws of the country in which it's physically stored. This difference is crucial, really, as the subjects of this data, so that's you and me, it's individuals whose personal data is being collected, held, processed, etc. These individuals will have different privacy and security protections according to where the data centers housing their data physically sit. This difference is also crucial for businesses, as a government's right of access to data found within its borders differ widely, really, from country to country. Data localization, this is the most restrictive of the three, and like data sovereignty, it's a version of the data residency based on legal obligations. It's also the concept that's growing the fastest, at least internationally. So to put it simply, data localization requires that the data created within certain borders stay within those borders. In contrast to data residency and data sovereignty, it's almost always applied to the creation and storage of personal data, with the exceptions in some countries over tax, accounting, and gambling. Now, some countries' law is so strict that it prevents data from crossing its borders at all. A good example of this is Russia's on-personal data law, OPD law, which requires the storage, the update, the retrieval of data on its citizens to be limited to data center resources within the Russian Federation. On the flip side, South Africa has close to zero data localization laws, while in China, companies with links to national security have to store their data on servers in China, but other company data can be stored elsewhere. I appreciate this can be confusing, these particular terms. So as a starting point, try applying the above distinctions to those key questions about your infrastructure. Where are each of your categories of data, so personal data, financial records, etc., created or processed, and what obligations might that bring to you and to your business? Where is it, or where will it be stored, and who owns that data center? Now, your data could be in a data center located where I am in the UK, but if that data center is owned by a company whose headquarters is in the US, then the US government may have the rights to access your data under the Cloud Act. Again, this isn't designed to scare you, but really just to make you aware that you may need to split or to re-architect applications to make them fit. It's not just another data center. The journey to the cloud does introduce a degree of complication, and in some instances will require specialist skills. And you may have concerns about security, but bear in mind that it's highly likely that the challenges that you faced have already been faced and addressed by the cloud provider and other clients that have moved their workloads to the cloud. You won't be the first doing this. Additionally, chances are the cloud provider will probably have more staff whose focus is security and this area than you. It's not all on you. Tom, do you want to talk to us about licensing considerations?
Absolutely, and I notice we're getting kind of close to that time period, so I'll kind of do this quickly. I mean, this is always a big issue. You know, when you start thinking about moving to the cloud, you have to think about, well, what about my operating system? And, you know, quite a long time ago, IBM worked with many of the managed service providers. Matter of fact, they used to have a event every year for MSPs down in Rochester, and I'm not sure if they may still do that. I don't know, but and they have worked out how to handle operating system license as you go into cloud, and that's true for both AIX and IBM I, and well, I should say Linux, throw that in there too for Power. Vendor pricing models are all over the board, and we're probably as guilty as anybody, but working with our sales team on a commercial standpoint, because we do have products that are licensed by number of users, and we have products that are licensed by you know, serial number, partition number, unlimited usage. But licensing wise, you know, we, from a help systems perspective, we do have the ability to move things around and provide, you know, we kind of call like an enterprise license agreement, and be able to move things. And then, of course, as you talk to the various vendors out there, they are going to offer up different discounts for dev, test, HA, DR. And it's always the question, you know, am I running the software in the cloud version versus the on-prem version? And it really depends upon each different product or application that you're running. You know, in some cases, even though I have two HA boxes, I still want to monitor both boxes. So, you know, monitoring software, you know, something like Performance Navigator, it's, you know, running on both sides. You really want statistics from your HA side and from your production side to best size your environment and know where you have issues. But there's more and more coming in this area. I know our team is delivering some new security codes this pretty shortly here. I'll just say by July 1st, that'll help out. And I know IBM has talked about some newer things relation to, I'll just call it a virtual serial number, so that those can be shared for where you're tied into serial numbers. Again, it all depends upon the vendors whether or not they take advantage of implementing those kinds of things too. Every vendor is going to be different, and you know, I hate to say it, they're not IBM, and it's like, and as a vendor and somebody who's been working in the space, and Randy has too for, you know, 3 decades, it's always kind of funny when you hear, well, IBM said you vendors should be doing this, and I'm like, well, you know, that's great. That's their opinion, just like it's our opinion. So we appreciate all your thought and process around this. It is a difficult and challenging discussion. But the big thing to think about, you move to the cloud, and if you're truly in a cloud environment, your partition or your VM is going to be moving around. So what does that do as your application goes from one serial number to another? I mean, that is a challenge for IBM customers, because everything has been by serial number partition and other mechanisms of licensing.
Thank you, Tom.
Yes, you're welcome.
So Help Systems has grown organically, and if you've probably seen in the press, via acquisition over the years, and really now offers two main areas of expertise. So end-to-end security solutions covering almost every platform imaginable, and a complete line of workload automation software solutions to automate a wide range of solutions, again, across pretty much every platform. Now,
so
we did
Ash, I was going to say, we've been getting a lot of great questions.
We have. I've picked a couple out, actually. I know we've overrun slightly with the technical aspect. Somebody has asked, they said they're running collection services, so running collection services data on I, but they don't have the knowledge to capture workload using it. Do we offer a service to analyze this data? Can I send it to somebody to analyze? Randy, that's probably a question for you.
Absolutely. So that's one of the services that Help Systems provides is capacity planning. And you can either do that directly with us as a customer, or, you know, sometimes customers go through their business partners, because we do a lot of this stuff through business partners. So absolutely, we do provide this because, you know, we do have, I personally have done thousands of these things. So I've seen a lot of different cases, and but we would be glad to help you out with that.
Fantastic, thank you. And probably time for one more, and this one's up your street, Tom. Is it possible to run logical replication solutions like RobotHA with both the source and target in the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no reason why you can't do that. I mean, it's VM to VM, and in the cloud environment, the thing to be careful is that tomorrow you might wake up and you're on a different serial number. So as long as you have flexible licensing in place, that workload could move around and continue to replicate. Obviously, the first step is migrating, and certainly logical replication is a great choice for migrating data to the cloud. You might do that for QA first and then HA next, right?
Brilliant, Tom. And I know RobotHA is built on top of remote journaling.
Right.
And RobotHA supports both async and synchronous delivery modes. So flexibility is also built into the product as well.
You know, Ash, one other thing that was in here was about, you know, you make it sound like it's as flexible as AWS and spinning things up. And reality is there's some technologies out there today that if you have a templated VM of IBM I, you can spin it up with the products you want in place in 5 minutes. Yes. Now, the same problem exists for AWS. Somebody has to configure the software, right? You got to set up the product to monitor QSysOp, or you got to set up the invoicing system. You have to set up, and the same thing is for AWS. You know, I just watched, you know, because Ash mentioned that we're a cross-platform. You know, I just watched my fellow pre-sales guys talk about or complain about going from one cloud provider to another and how long it took them to reconfigure their environments. That stuff doesn't go away. It's software. I don't care if it's IBM I, Linux, Windows, whatever. You still have to do the configurations. And so, Steve, your point is well taken, but you know, it just really depends upon configuration, and those things don't go away.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think that's probably all the questions we've actually got time for. So I hope this webinar didn't come over as anti-cloud. That certainly wasn't the intention, but moving to the cloud isn't just an infrastructure refresh exercise. You're re-engineering the underlying architecture of your core business applications. So thank you for listening, and thanks to Tom and Randy for sharing their wisdom.
You're welcome. And this, we did record this, and you will get an ability to replay this. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Awesome, awesome job, Ash.